Mary Jane Kelly. She is the victim about whom we know the least. In fact, we know virtually nothing about her life prior to her arrival in East End London, and what we do know is based on what she chose to reveal about her past to those she knew, and the veracity of what she did reveal is difficult to ascertain. Indeed, we don't know for certain that her name was actually Mary Kelly. According to her boyfriend, Joseph Barnett, with whom she lived until shortly before her death, she had told him that she was born in Limerick, in Ireland, that her father's name was John Kelly, and that she had 6 or 7 brothers and 1 sister. The family moved to Wales when she was a child, and when she was 16, she met and married a collier named Davies. 3 years later, her husband was killed in a mine explosion. Mary moved to Cardiff to live with the female cousin who introduced her into prostitution. Mary moved to London around 1884, where she made the acquaintance of a Frenchwoman who ran a high-class brothel in Knightsbridge, in which establishment Mary began working. She told Barnett that during this period of her life she had dressed well and had been driven about in a carriage and, for a time, had led the life of a lady. She had, she said, made several visits to France at that time and had accompanied a gentleman to Paris, but not liking it there, she had returned to London just 2 weeks later. From then on, she began using the continental version of her name and often referred to herself as Marie Jeanette Kelly. Thereafter, her life suffered a downward spiral, which saw her move to the East End of London in a side thoroughfare off Ratcliffe Highway. Soon after arrival, she enlisted her landlady's assistance in returning to the West End to retrieve a box which contained dresses of a costly description from a French lady. Mary now started drinking heavily, and this led to conflict between her and Mrs. Buki. Relationships between them became very strained, so Mary moved out and went to lodge at the home of Miss Mary McCarthy at 1 Breezers Hill, Peddington Street in St. George in the East. By 1886, she had moved into Cooley's Common Lodging House on Thrall Street, and it was whilst living there that, on Good Friday, April 6, 1887, she met Joseph Barnett, who worked as a porter at Billingsgate Fish Market. The two were soon living together, and by 1888, they were renting a tiny room at 13 Miller's Court from John McCarthy, who owned a chandelier shop just outside Miller's Court on Dorset Street. She and Barnett appeared to live happily together until the mid-1880s. He lost his market job, and she returned to prostitution, which caused arguments between them. During one heated exchange, a pane of window by the door of the room had been broken. The precariousness of their finances had resulted in Mary falling behind with her rent. By early November, she owed the landlord 29 shillings in rent arrears. On October 30th, 1888, Joseph Barnett moved out, although he and Mary remained on friendly terms, and who would drop by to see her, the last time being around 7:30 on the evening, Thursday, November 8th, albeit he didn't stay long. Several people have seen her during the next 14 hours. One of them was George Hutchinson, an unemployed laborer who met her on Commercial Street at 2 a.m. on November 9th. She asked him if he would lend her 6pence, to which he replied he couldn't, as he'd spent all his money. Replying that she must go and find some money, she continued along Commercial Street, where a man coming from the opposite direction topped her on shoulder, said something to her, whereupon they both started laughing. The man put his arm around Mary. They started walking back along Commercial Street, past Hutchinson, who was standing under a lamp by the Queen's Head pub at the junction of Fashion Street and Commercial Street. Although the man had his head down with a hat over his eyes, Hutchinson stooped down as looked him in the face, whereupon the man gave Hutchinson would later describe as a stern look. Hutchinson followed them as they crossed into Dorset Street, and he watched them turn into Miller's Court. He waited outside the court for 45 minutes, by which time they hadn't re-emerged, so he left the scene. Around 4 a.m., 2 of Mary's neighbors heard a faint cry of murder, but because such cries were frequent in the area, often as a result of a drunken brawl, they both ignored it. At 10:45 in the morning of November 9th, her landlord, John McCarthy, sent his assistant, Thomas Boyer, into Mary's room, telling him to try and get some rent from her. Boyer marched into Miller's Court and banged on the door. There was no reply. He tried to open it, found it locked, and therefore he went around to the broken window pane, reached in, pushed aside the shabby muslin curtain that covered it, and looked into the gloomy room. Moments later, an ashen-faced Bauer burst back into McCarthy's shop on Dorset Street. I knocked at the door and could not make anyone answer. I looked through the window and saw a lot of blood. "Good God, you don't mean that," was McCarthy's reply, and the two men raced into the Miller's Court, where McCarthy stooped down and looked through the broken pane of glass. McCarthy would later recall the horrific scene that greeted him. "The sight we saw I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked more the work of the devil than of a man. I had heard a great deal about the Whitechapel murders, but I declare to God I would never expect to see such a sight as this. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I may never see such a sight again." The police were immediately sent off for, and one of the first officers on the scene was Walter Dew, who, many years later, would recall the horror of what he saw through the window. On the bed was all that remained of a young woman. There was little left of her, not much more than a skeleton. Her face was terribly scarred and mutilated. All this was horrifying enough, but the mental picture of the sight of which remains most vividly was with me as a poor woman's eyes. They were wide open and seemed to be staring straight through me with a look of terror. As news of another murder spread through the neighborhood, crowds of people converged at both ends of Dorset Street. The police constables struggled to keep them at bay. More detectives and doctors were now arriving at Miller's Court, but the police delayed entering the room, as they believed they had been ordered to wait for bloodhounds to be brought to the scene where they can be put on the scent of the killer. But just before 1:30 p.m., they received word that the order for bloodhounds had been countermanded, and they asked John McCarthy to force the door open, which he did with a pickaxe. What they saw and smelt that afternoon, as they filled into a tiny room, would haunt many of those present for years afterwards, as the horror of the experience is succinctly expressed by one of the attending doctors, who later told journalists that he had been a great deal into dissecting rooms. He never witnessed such horrible sight as the inside of 13 Miller's Court. The police and doctors had spent the next few hours carrying out a detailed inspection of the crime scene. In addition, a photographer was brought in, and the body was photographed as it lay on the bed. This horrific and haunting image still exists, and is one of the earliest crime scene photos we have. What nobody could have realized at the time was that in bloody carnage of the tiny room in Miller's Court, the autumn of terror had reached its conclusion. In the days and weeks that followed, the district returned to some semblance of normality. Yes, there would be further murders that were included in the Whitechapel murderer's file, but there is now a general consensus these were not carried out by Jack the Ripper. As for the legacy of the crimes, they certainly did focus attention on the plight of the poor who lived in the area that would be later dubbed the Abyss. But whether the murders helped bring about the change of the horrific social conditions, as is often claimed, is debatable. Today, people come from all over the world to lay flowers, coins, and other trinkets on and around the victims' memorials, and they spend a few quiet moments remembering Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. 5 women whose horrific deaths force us to confront the tragedy and hardships of their lives. And there, perhaps, is the paradox on which we end our journey, where there can be no doubt that their names would have been long forgotten were it not, in fact, that they were murdered by a man whose name we will now never know for certain. Another letter was sent mocking the police, written in red ink. This is referred to as the Dear Boss letter, and it goes as follows.
Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about the leather apron gave me a real fits. I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them until I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in the ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink fits enough, I hope. The next job I do, I shall clip the ladies' ears off and send them to the police officers just for jollies, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away. If I get a chance, good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.